And joining me live is independent journalist Antony Loewenstein. Thanks for joining us this morning, Antony. We've been hearing reports this morning the officials from the Biden administration are set to arrive in Israel to try and initiate peace talks with leaders. What more can you tell us?
Well, obviously, we all want peace, and I'm very much of that persuasion as well. I'm a journalist who was based in Jerusalem between 2016 and 2020, so I've seen a lot of these realities on the ground. I've visited Gaza in the West Bank. This sort of latest flare-up in the last week or so really is the context has to be seen of where this is coming from, which essentially is not just what's happening now. I think a lot of the media gets overly focused on the question of Hamas fires rockets, Israel allegedly kind of fires back. This is an occupation. And for those who don't know what that means, Israel has been occupying Palestinian territory, Gaza in the West Bank, for over 50 years. And there are roughly 5 million Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza who do not have equal rights. In fact, they have no rights. They can't vote in Israeli elections and therefore they don't control their own lives. Now, I don't personally support Hamas firing rockets into Israel. I think it's unconscionable. It's against international law, so there's no question about that. But this is not a conflict between two equal sides. Israel is the occupier and the Palestinians are the occupied. And I very much hope that the Biden administration can bring peace. But for anyone who lives in the Arab Muslim world, or I'm Jewish myself, and I've been deeply critical for years of Israel, even though the majority of Jews you may speak to are very supportive of Israel, the truth is that the US is never an honest broker. They very much are in the pocket of Israel. And what that means practically is that when you read about the Biden administration is sending someone to the Middle East to solve the conflict, what that means is to suit Israel's terms. So many Palestinians are rightly sceptical.
And what do you think Israel's government is hoping to achieve, Antony?
Well, in the current conflict, probably, as this term that the Israelis often use called mowing the lawn, which essentially is this deeply racist expression, which means that every few years they go into Gaza, which they completely occupy, to bomb things, to try to deter Hamas that controls the Gaza Strip. And the truth is, though, that Israel actually has no desire to overthrow Hamas. You often read in the media a lot of these issues about Hamas threatens Israel's reality or Israel's existential reality. That's simply not true. Hamas, as I said, fires rockets. In my view, it shouldn't be doing that. But the truth is that Hamas is a convenient enemy of Israel. It doesn't threaten its existence. And the truth is that over the last decade, something I've written a lot about in my work, and often you don't read enough about this in the Western media, Israel has taken a very, very far turn to the right. So when you have, for example, in the current government, far-right fascists, that's not simply my term, that is literally what they are, who advocate for the genocide against Palestinians, that to me is what we should be thinking about. And as someone who is Jewish, who's deeply ashamed of what's going on, who spent years advocating against what's going on as a journalist and also as a Jew and as an Australian, I think we should be putting that kind of into context about what's actually happening on the ground, that there's an Israeli population, not all Israelis, of course. I have Israeli friends who are deeply critical and upset with what's going on, but enough of the Israeli political elite have so much contempt for Palestinian lives that they believe, as I might add the Australian government does, that Israel can simply occupy Palestinian territory indefinitely, which is why there are growing numbers of groups around the world, and Jews and Palestinians and many others, who oppose what Israel is doing and say, not in my name.
And as you mentioned, you lived in Jerusalem and you understand the local culture very well indeed. Can you explain a little bit more what it is like there, particularly between people living in contentious neighbourhoods like Sheikh Jarrah?
Yeah, so I lived actually in Sheikh Jarrah between 2016 and 2020. And for viewers who don't know what that is, that's a town in occupied East Jerusalem. And literally down the road from my house, there are some of these houses that some of your viewers may have heard about where Israel's wanting to forcibly evict Palestinians who have been there for decades. And I have spent time around those homes. I've spent time with the Palestinians who are likely to be kicked out by Israel. There's a lot of tension there. And in fact, you know, living there for so many years, and as I said, I'm someone Jewish, so there was never discrimination against me. But what I did see constantly, almost every day, in fact, were Israeli police discriminating and harassing and racially profiling Palestinians, harassing them, pulling them aside. I saw it literally every single day. So the context is that people who live in East Jerusalem are not equal citizens. And there is an attempt in the last decades to forcibly push out many Palestinians in that area and try to bring Jews in there, which obviously is a combustible mix. It's an occupation. And for I think a lot of people in Australia, it may be hard to understand what that means. But what that essentially means is that Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem or the West Bank or Gaza, they don't have equal rights to Jews. And to me, that is simply unacceptable. And I should also add that Human Rights Watch, just a month ago, put out a report by the leading human rights organisation in the world, saying that what Israel is doing across the entire territory, both in East Jerusalem, West Bank and Gaza, is apartheid. And they use that term not just to compare things to what happened in apartheid South Africa, but to say that apartheid is a legally recognised term that means there should be action against Israel for doing so, sanctions, etc. So it's a really deeply concerning situation. It's actually only getting worse.
It certainly sounds that way, and really appreciate your expertise and time this morning. We do have to wrap it up there, but to Antony Loewenstein, we'll talk to you again soon, hopefully. But thank you for joining us on Weekend Edition this morning.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.